In this video, I would like to only comment on Murray's four essential properties of digital environments within the bigger frame of the course about screens, about what screens on a video game or in a digital narrative environment actually mean. Murray defines four essential properties, which come into two sets: the procedural and participatory properties equal more or less what we, newbies, what we people who are not specialists call interactive when it comes to being online or to various forms of narratives reading. The last two properties, so the spatial and the encyclopedic nature of being online, of digital environments in general, equal more or less what we call immersive, as in this game is such an immersive experience, that kind of things, and this is something that you can read either from, the public, from the audiences or tests or that kind of things. And I would like to go in detail, in these four categories before moving on to the rest of the course. When she says that the computer is an engine, what we mean by that is, an engine, un moteur, littéralement un engine, are things that you feed with fuel, basically, and they create something new, basically. If you take a car, you put, gas into a car, and it turns it through a series of mechanical and physical, changes into energy. It propels the car forward, and what propels it is the engine itself. I'm not really good at mechanical stuff like this, but let's assume that everybody understands that. And that's very important. That means that computers are not just like a super big suitcase, and that the encyclopedic property is only one of a series of an array of properties. So that means that since computers are not just encyclopedias, they don't just hold information. But if you still look at the metaphor with the car, with you input gas in one hole and then your car gets moving type of metaphor, if you frame it this way, information is recombined through parameters that were already established by game designers, by maybe you, if you are going to write an interactive piece of fiction or a little game, I quote, "If we can write rules for computers that are recognizable as interpretations of the world, then, it's all good for us as game designers, as storytellers within a digital frame, in general." Murray tries to say that the real challenge is to make such rule writing available to people. Available to writers, I quote, as musical notation is available to composers. Well, good news. Through the last part of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, there have been more and more tools, and Twine that we use here is one of them, because Inkle is another one. And people like Anna Anthropy have really tried to put forward, to promote the use of such little, writing elements, to little tools, in order to create little engines that we can use to create stories in turn. En très gros, ce que j'essaie de dire là, c'est que Murray, qui écrit dans les années 90, nous dit aussi que ce qui est important, c'est l'écriture et la conversion, si vous voulez, de la vraie vie ou des informations qu'on veut mettre dans un jeu. Et puis la deuxième chose, c'est ce qui serait bien, mais son livre, la première édition de son livre était ancienne, Ce qui serait bien, c'est que on puisse permettre que des outils pareils soient utilisés un peu partout. Hein. Et ce qui est bien, c'est que c'est le cas maintenant. But procedural means that you just add things onto another. You have parameters, you create rules, you define elements. She takes the example of Eliza, which is a very rudimental artificial intelligence. It's not rudimental because it says bad things, quite the contrary, actually. It's rudimental because it's old, so it is not fed with as many elements as what we would use nowadays, to create narratives within, or for uh, uh, um, well, an engine, whatever it is. And very often you have people who are versed in one particular game engine, like Unreal, like Unity, and that kind of things, because you have engines within engines, and that's how a computer can be procedural several ways. If you have a bug, for instance, with a game that is completed and hopefully without bugs itself, then it's just the engine within the other engine, which is a problem. I'll go back onto that if it's not very clear. Second property, the fact that computers are participatory elements, and that digital environments have people interfere comment, create, be, all and about with new media in general. We will maybe have time, maybe not have time to talk about Henry Jenkins, oh shit, well, in Convergence Culture. The book is right here, and yeah, I knew it was a bad idea what I'm doing, but there it is. It is a book absolutely about the participatory, or rather, that tackles the participatory vision and nature of digital environments, basically. But there is something very small, and I'm not talking, Jenkins's work about fan domains and bases and other types of convergence of media doesn't allow us to forget that first and foremost, participatory means on a very small scale that digital environments will answer in a reliable way to inputs that we create ourselves. I have a keyboard on my computer, and I'm fairly sure that given the right window, like if I'm typing in a text box or in Word or in Open Office or that kind of things, if I type a W, there is going to be a W somewhere on my screen. If there isn't, then there's a problem. But basically, the we can induce the behavior bit that the quote from Murray just says that very little, that very thing. The codified rendering of the computer, the way the computer renders elements, either visually or through text or whatever, what you see is what you get type of thing. For instance, if we're still talking about a text processor, a piece of software, is part of this participatory nature of digital environments. When we move forward, when I take my controller in my hands, and when I move forward using this joystick, the behavior I made creates a new behavior on the screen. And this is very often what is said about interaction and why computers are said to be interactive, because the inputs we create in a game have been codified before. That's the procedural part. And through the participatory element, and once again Milton is here and I'm very sorry about that, computers answer to the inputs we create. it's been noted by Murray and by other people that there were several very little video games. At the very beginning it was hard to create video games, obviously, because of a lot of technical limitations. But the development of video games was also allowed and facilitated through the creation of interpreters, like Lisp, for instance, but I'm not going to go into technical details. As a linguist, I really like the fact that an interpreter is exactly that. The machine. If we have the machine versus the human type of dichotomy, si on fait une dichotomie, l'homme, la machine, par exemple, qui est hyper classique, the computers are talking to one another or are communicating using binary code, either zeros or ones, and we use code to talk to them. And this code that we write down, hello world, is the snippet of code that you have to create when you learn a new programming language. La première chose qu'on fait quand on apprend à utiliser des langages informatiques, c'est réussir à sortir ce qu'on appelle un hello world. C'est ça, le snippet, c'est vraiment un élément de la langue qui va vous permettre de comprendre un peu la syntaxe générale. So the very first thing, even when you create a hello world, this thing is going to be interpreted, through the interpreter, and it's going to change our code into a language the computer can comprehend, because I do not speak binary, and very few people understand and can read binary. It's not something that you usually do, and you can, and that's fine, to each his own. But the use of a interpreter and the use of fine-tuned tools in order to create a program also allows to test elements. Just like you test arguments in Twine and see what works, what doesn't, and maybe there could be an argument missing, maybe you made a syntax error, or you used a wrong argument, or that kind of things, the programmer can test methodically and should test methodically, but humans in life and everything happens, and people don't always do that really well. But the fact that you can test elements one by one allows also a greater usability, liability, if you want, que les choses soient pliables, plastiques si vous voulez, mais pas dans le sens de la matière. Le fait qu'on puisse tester petit élément par petit élément, c'est hyper important. On Twine, you can test a passage on its own and not a full story, and it's the case in many video games, for many video games, and the one of the examples that is taken, because it's such a good example, is a game called Zork. It was a text-based dungeon, if you want, a little bit like Dungeons and Dragons, in that kind of a fantasy world, where you wrote arguments yourself, and you wrote enter door or push button or whatever, attack roll, and the game would react and write a sentence on the screen that would build onto what you put. And you could even write things that were a little ambiguous, like you could type in drink, and if the game found a beverage in your inventory or around you, you would get to drink this beverage, So you could experiment with arguments like that. This is called object-oriented software design. You hover around and you play around with objects, and you put these. That's also how Twine uses several arguments. We'll talk about this later. And as far as ambiguous things went, I told you, so the game, if you just write drink, the game looks around and sees if there is a beverage. If you type attack, for instance, the game will look for whatever is attackable. That plays also on the affordance of your environment, on the ecology of the environment you're in. But also, if you have several weapons, if you have several beverages in your inventory, the game will ask you which one to use. So you type something and the computer builds onto that. Basically, these um, possibilities, this flexibility, this lability. I'm still struggling to find the correct word, and I don't know why I'm using this one when plasticity would work just as well. But well, once again, these participatory elements look a lot like what role playing games do, basically. First, the rules were defined. When you have a procedure going on, you define everything that you want to play with. You say, like, if we take role playing games, you have classes of characters that you can embody, and fighters will tend to have more physical strength. And the dungeon master, and the person you play with, le maître de jeu, will tell you what and what not to do when you create your character, according to the rules, to the rule book, to whatever convention is accepted between you and the game master, because that's also something important. And yeah, you use the rules and the limits that you defined, and then you define the interactors. The interactors are part of this participatory thing. And if you can't attack anything, well, the game's just going to say, no, that's not possible. That's not something that you do. But that's part of this participatory element in digital environments. Moving on to the spatial nature, and this is going to go much faster than it did for the first two. The spatial element and the spatial property feature is the fact that navigable space is easy to see, and computers have been used to create card maps, to create navigations, to triangulate places, and to calculate weather. And since computers were invented also for military purposes, the ability of having a reliable map of the world, just in case, is very important. Um, but yeah, the ability to navigate is also something that we have here. And actually, this screen grab illustrates a lot of things. Like this illustrates the elements that you write, and here you see the game that is being created here, and the game is here written in English, and you have also arguments that are directly fed to the engine through the compiler. And here you have a representation of whatever your game will look like. Here you have a little space, and you get to navigate within this space. And you have small maps, bigger maps, and so on in the world of the video game. Navigation is space is a terrible concept, because it's actually twofold in itself. Navigate space equals time very often, and the two very often go hand in hand. And Anna Anthropy came up with a game where you only have 10 seconds to navigate through the screen, to look at whatever. There are games where you have to look for the next part. So whatever is going on the screen is part of how you advance forward, how you move forward with the game. But the navigation is also made through time, and time is important. What's on the screen is also immediate. Here the game says you are in the castle, and there is no turning back. Right now you're in the castle, and if a trap door opens or closes, or if someone attacks you, they're not attacking you in 10 seconds. And what you see on the screen is basically what you get as well. Everything is immediate. It's exactly the same, in a lot of other types of games. When you play card games, some people may be adamant about some rules, like ah bah non, hein, tu vas quand même pas une carte posée, carte jouée. If I remember that correctly, and when you put a card on the table, and what has been placed on the table does not move anymore. Now that's very important. Whatever happened in the very close past is irremediably linked to whatever is happening in the future. And maybe, if you're playing with children or with a like a nicer crowd, or people who are a little less into games, you may have the right to retract yourself. But it's not the case. It's not the case in video games. It's not the case in certain role playing games as well, where you say to the game master, okay, I move forward and I enter the door to my left. And then you say, and then maybe your game master will say, why, are you sure about that? Do you really want to do this? And if your game master says that, maybe you go, oh, they're giving me a clue as to what to do, and maybe I should be a little more careful. Maybe I should cast a spell to see if there is a trap or something like this. But space and time, the ability, as we said, to be spatialized, corresponds to our ability to move forward in time and to move forward in space. Spatiality equals space, equals time. Many games play on the spatiality of video games. I told you about mazes. I told you about people who didn't want to play or retract themselves in certain games. Some games like Life is Strange plays on the ability to go back in time. Other games have the ability to have different timelines at the same time, or to rewrite the future thanks to what you did in the past, and so on and so forth. This is a very important game mechanic that is used. Okay, and last property is the encyclopedic nature of digital environments as well. The don't forget when Murray's book was released and where she comes from. And I mean, I guess people are all very like, when there was this turn towards a more computer-based environment and narrations and ways of creating things, and expressing oneself through a new media, really. Big data and that kind of things became very important. Books, they don't hold that much. LPs and CDs and tapes do not hold a candle. Elles sont beaucoup moins. Il y a beaucoup moins d'espace sur un disque, sur une cassette, que sur un DVD, que sur un disque dur. C'est ça que j'essaye de dire ici. And the big data that we're building, that there are lakes now. Instead of just talking about data, when in the world of IT and that kind of things, they moved to the notion of lakes as there is so much data that you have to go look through it. You have to fish for information, basically. But well, that's not my specialty, as you understand. But the capacity of what a computer can hold has evolved dramatically. There are jokes going around in the gaming community, and when I say gaming community, I talk about game designers, people who write games, who say that very often encyclopedias made by fans are super useful to remember things that they wrote themselves that they can't remember at all, because of the fact that there are so many things going on in their games that it's just impossible to remember. Just the way, some TV series have continuity errors, and fans say, well, yeah, he says here that his father is Dutch, but actually 2 seasons ago he said that his father was from Switzerland or something like this. And these continuity things are induced by this encyclopedic nature of digital environments. um, the cyberspace in general. I don't really like the word because yeah, it's a little dated now. But the structure of the internet right now is very much web like. You have several games where you can expand, also where you have an encyclopedia part, especially in long games where there's a lot of lore going on. Lore, L-O-R-E, hein, c'est le même mot que dans folklore, le folklore, où en fait c'est littéralement la culture, la connaissance du peuple, hein. Mais ça, vous le savez déjà, certainement, je répète, au cas où. Um, the expansion of long franchises to different worlds, to a lot of very important elements, create, well, a multiplication of everything you should know, that you should read, that has been said before, and so on, in long narratives. There are several problems linked to that. There is too much scrolling. You can really lose like the dynamic nature of a story because um, you can become very long, tedious storytelling without much of a dynamic nature to it. Too much navigation, maybe a ploy, maybe something to have you descend into the lull of adult story. Like I think that Doki Doki, the video game, works so well is because the first part of the game, where there's just the repetition over and over again of this very sweet but unsavory story about you being a teenage boy, being in a club with the girls and blah blah blah, and you have to talk to them, and then the game switches to horror, and I think that the long, tedious nature of the beginning of the introductory part, the first act, really helps, but it's not always the case. The encyclopedic nature of several games may be a problem, may be strange, may be good. I will just talk very briefly about simulation games, where, for instance, in SimCity, you were able to build a city according to whatever you wanted, to have commercial areas close to maybe habitations, and close or not to industrial areas. And you had to deal with the power lines and all that kind of things, and that was nice. But even in a game like SimCity, yeah, in SimCity, there were super cities like Magna Santi created. I will show you Magna Santi, and it is so big. It is yeah. It's the creation of it's the biggest city. It's been optimized to the latest, highest notch. It's very impressive for such a game. Um, but you also have games like Geopolitical Simulator, which I'll talk about a little later in class if you want to, which is made, and the creators are very proud to have created such an in-depth game with Les Gilets Jaunes were included in a DLC to this game. It was really about like a lot of little crises everywhere in the world, basically. But it is very heavy. It is very hard to understand everything. So the scope and the freedom given to the players, the amount of rules given to the player, can be overwhelming, really. A good idea. If you want to have an encyclopedic game, you could maybe play around like Orwell, which is a really good game where it's very short, but it's a good game where the player has to cross, images and references. You play an agent of the government, and you have to decide through your, looking at online profiles and, websites and that kind of things, if people are terrorists or not. But here, you cross references, you have hypertexts created, you have a web created between people so that, who's guilty, who's innocent, who is into W's schemes, and so on. So here, maybe the encyclopedic nature of the game is a little better, or at least it's dealt in a way that is not overwhelming to the player. Um, Maybe also I'm being too harsh on geopolitical simulator. There are a lot of tests online, and I can list some of them. Um, if I remember correctly, Le Joueur du Grenier ended up declaring war on Belgium, but it was not possible with France because it was playing the French president, and it he got an embargo on France. I mean, it ended up in havoc. Really, it was just a disaster in itself, just because he just wanted to test the games and the rules to their limit. But I mean, this game is very honest as what it offers, or what it adds in terms of politics, and what is hidden in terms of politics, and what is hidden or not in the scope of the game itself. Because if you just deal with a city, it's not the same as if you deal with a whole civilization, as in the world. Civilization by the game, sorry, Civilization by Sid Meier. It's the same for geopolitical simulator, where you play one, you just play the political elements. I mean, it's called geopolitical simulator for a good reason. Um, so yeah, the question also of what you add, what you hide, also in terms of politics, is very important in these very complex lores that have been created, in these very complex worlds that have been created. I hope this video was clear, and I will see you soon in class. Thank you very much for watching.